The Broken Economics of the Oceans. Čia netoks senas video, kelios dienos.
New Guinea, this massive island, is split vertically in two by the border between Papua New Guinea and Indonesia, then split horizontally by the towering Central Cordillera Range. These peaks stretch so high as to produce snow in probably just a few hundred miles from the equator, then this snow melts off. It funnels down into valleys, filling rivers, fueling agriculture, then finally depositing its nutrient-rich flow into the island's coastal mangrove forests. The vitality of these forests translates into their vitality as fish spawning ground. Marine life, lots of marine life, starts its life here, then swims out and matures in the Arafura Sea. This sea, nestled between Indonesia and Australia, is one of the most productive fisheries in the world, or at least it used to be. Legally, territorially, it's split in two. Australia has the southern half, Indonesia has the northern half, but Indonesia, historically, did little to restrict and enforce restrictions on fishing these waters. A 2001 survey found that 85% of vessels over 50 gross tons were operating without a license, and a mere 30% of catch was being properly reported. But the story's rather different on the other side of the sea. Australia's north is extremely sparsely populated. Save for the city of Darwin, the coast is just dotted with extremely small towns every couple hundred miles. Correspondingly, the region has never had a massive fishing industry despite its location on the Arafura Sea. The Northern Territory, with the most Arafura coastline, has a mere 147 registered fishing vessels, and this seems to make sense. Cost of living is far higher in Australia than Indonesia. GDP per capita is 14 times higher on the southern side of the sea, yet the distance from either side to Australia's populated southeast is roughly equivalent. Therefore, Indonesia's fishing industry is likely able to outcompete on cost in the Australian market and beyond, and so the vast majority of the Arafura Sea fishing has occurred in Indonesia's exclusive economic zone. While very difficult to definitively prove, there is a corresponding belief among Indonesian fishers that the Australian side is more plentiful in fish, and they're likely right. They're especially right when it comes to one specific, highly valuable fish: the shark. Shark fishing is rare in Australia, and shark finning is entirely illegal. That's the practice of catching a shark, cutting off its fins, and throwing the rest of the animal back into the ocean to die. This is done because shark fins are extremely valuable in Asian markets especially, often selling for over $500 per pound or $225 per kilogram. The rest of the body is less valuable, so to save space on their small boats and more easily get their illicit product to market, poachers will often only keep the fins. This means a single poacher could kill dozens, even hundreds of sharks in one journey. But considering finning is illegal and well enforced in Australia, and considering shark hunting writ large is so rare and well enforced, Australia's coastal shark populations are doing well, at least compared to those on the north side of the sea. But poachers know this, and so here's what happens. A small wooden boat leaves from the small island city of Dobo. It tracks south and continues tracking south outside of Indonesia's exclusive economic zone, where it has rights to fish, and into Australia's, where it does not. Thanks to the sea's shallow depths and ultimately mellow conditions, it's able to make it all the way to this collection of islands on Australia's northern coast. The islands are unpopulated and far from anywhere that is, so they're able to set up camp on Australian soil, spending their days searching through the surrounding bays, finding and finning shark as they go. This is entirely illegal. They don't have the right to fish, they don't have the right to fish in this manner, and they don't have the right to step on Australian soil, but there's little chance they'll face consequences. The Australian Navy does patrol the coast, but it's just so vast and desolate that the odds are in the Indonesian fishers' favor. Even if they do get caught, punishment can only happen if the Navy can successfully get personnel on the Indonesian boat. The boat might stop, but they regularly don't. They put spikes or spears on the sides of their hulls to make boarding riskier, then head full speed north towards the border between Australian and Indonesian waters. It might take hours, it might take days, but once they cross that line, there's nothing the Australians can do. And knowing the risks of attempting to board a small boat with sharp obstacles at high speed, the Navy might decide to abandon the chase long before that line. While arrests do happen, and are happening in record numbers, it's understood that these only represent a small fraction of the incursions into Australian waters. So Australia's well-protected fish stocks are being plundered.
Aziečiai yra labiausiai atsakingi už žemės ridenimą link Doomsday. Gal atomkiam užmėtum jas? Sprendžiam šitą problemą. Ką galvojat? Niuniukinam tiesiog jas visus. Ir kiniečius tada, ir rusus. Davai? Davai. Amerikiečiai bandė, per mažai naudojo bombų ir per silpnas. Neišsprendė problemos glutinai gerai, čia šiekauju.
Ultimately, though, they're being plundered by the plundered. Indonesian fishers are not truly responsible.
Beje, jūs iš vis valgot žuvį? Aš nesu žuvies valgytojas. Tipo, kartais, kai kas nors ten kur nors būna, gal, bet nesu iš tikro žuvies valgytojas. Ypač dabar, kai mikroplastikų randa žuvyse ištisai visur, visą laiką. Tai kažkaip taip, tikrai tą žuvį reikia valgyti dabar ir tikrai yra tolkas valgyti, nes tipo, kam realiai? Trumpa istorija Japonijos. Manau, pasako tiesiog viską, ką reikia žinoti iš tikrųjų. Mes čia gan protingi, adekvatų žmonės, o istoriją mes domimės labai netgi. Jep. Gerai, žiūrim toliau.
For the downfall of their fishery. Rather, it was foreign vessels that trawled their ocean treasures. Consider the country's neighbors. According to the Illegal, Unreported, and Unregulated Fishing Index, which scores countries and regions on their vulnerability to illegal practices, Indonesia itself ranks 20th in the world, while its neighbors in the Pacific rank even worse. Japan is 12th, South Korea is 3rd, Russia is 2nd, and then there's China. Not only is China number 1 in the IUU fishing index,
China number 1
in by far the most fish tonnage year in, year out, and is home to by far the biggest fishing fleet in the world, effectively providing a recipe for overfishing at a global scale on its own. China's appetite for the ocean was born in the 1980s as personal income began an ascent that is yet to meaningfully slow. By 2000, after catch tonnage in China's EEZ had quadrupled, the nation's fisheries were on the verge of collapse, so state planners and struggling boat captains alike turned their attention to foreign and contested waters, sometimes legally, other times not. With their own fisheries in trouble, Indonesia tried to halt foreign fleets from entering its waters in 2014. The poaching vessels it caught, once processed, were publicly blown up or burned down at sea as a show of force. Yet, even in the face of potentially losing their vessels for good, Chinese boats were identified in the hundreds across Indonesian waters in the wake of the policy. There were simply too many for the cash-strapped country to possibly catch. Their seas now plundered, Indonesian fishers turned their attention then towards Australia. But the influence of China's massive, unwieldy, unregulated fishing force is felt far beyond the Western Pacific. China is also home to the world's largest distant water fleet. Boats big enough and capable enough to cross oceans, not just stick to coasts. Exactly how big this fleet is, no one's quite sure, as some reports have estimated the number in the 3,000s, while more recent estimates have put it at 17,000. Either way, it is massive, as the US distant water fleet, for comparison, is only 300 boats. This Chinese armada has taken Asian Pacific problems and exported them around the globe. Take West Africa, for example. Here, off the rich coasts of Mauritania, south to Sierra Leone, Chinese companies have been buying fishing licenses and fishing since the mid-1980s. In the past decade, though, these parties, African governments and Chinese fishing companies, have reached a reckoning point. While the countries have offered specific catch quotas to fishing companies to protect the nation's stock, local fishing communities have noticed an alarming lack of fish. In Senegal, where a fifth of all people work in fishing and some 85% of protein intake is fish, this has destroyed jobs and created real food scarcity. And it isn't due to over-allocating fishing licenses, but because Chinese ships report only a paltry 8% of their actual catch along the African coasts. For their part, Senegal has, at points, discontinued offering fishing licenses to foreign boats. But this only does so much, as Senegal, nor developing countries like it, have the navy or...
Tipo, imagine apskritai turėt darbą. Ir tada imagine tavo darbą žvejot, blėt, kasdieną. Fuck me. Fuck. Du dalykai, kur nekenčiu. Darbas ir dar vanduo. Wow. Wow, tiesiog.
Or satellite tracking capabilities to enforce moratoriums. And even when boats respect such fishing freezes, they still can simply move operations to the edge of Senegal's exclusive economic zone to international waters, continuing to fish around the clock. No matter where you look, these distant water fleets are crushing fisheries with little regard for national or international rules. Back in the Pacific, tracking services have followed Chinese fleets into North Korean waters. This likely explains why fragments of Korean ships have been mysteriously washing up on Japanese beaches. Local fishers can't compete in their own waters now dominated by Chinese ships, so they've gone farther out to sea where their small boats are battered and crews are sent overboard. But beyond bullying local fishers, moving into this EEZ is another blatant disregard for the rules, as they're ignoring UN sanctions that forbid fishing in North Korean waters while simultaneously wiping out North Korea's fish population. The pattern repeats on the high seas too, where international laws are looser to begin with. In recent years, Chinese fishing armadas have earned the
Kaip keleivis, taip consistently gali pasakyti kaip ir susijusių dalyką, bet visiškai ne į temą. Kaip taip įmanoma? Čia yra talentas. Holy fuck.
Moniker of dark fleets as they've suspiciously disabled.
Jo keleivi, mes čia šnekėjom apie savo laisvalaikiu, kai išeini su meškare pažvejoji. Taip. Ir jis net nesupranta šito. Jis nesupranta, kiek nesuprato, ką kalbėjau, ką sakiau ir kaip jisai vapšė ne į temą. Ir taip consistently, apie ką bešnekėtumėm. Man yra fascinating tiesiog.
AIS tracking systems for days and weeks at a time. This allows fishing vessels to sneak into EEZs, fish, then quietly slide back into international waters where they turn their transponders back on. It also allows fishing companies to launder their catch, as a fishing ship will go dark and unload their catch onto larger transport ships, which muddies the water on where exactly the catch originated and allows the boat to illegally dump low-grade fish or move illegal catches. This is called transshipment, which, while legal when authorized by regional authorities, is often done with transponders turned off. But while both sneaking into EEZs and unauthorized transshipments are illegal, both require evidence to prove the fleet's guilty. While it's obvious that's what they're probably doing, someone needs to catch the companies in the act, then catch the boats themselves, two tasks that are both extremely expensive and extremely difficult in the endless expanse of the ocean. So it continues. Small operators catch the fish they're not supposed to in places they're not supposed to. Large operators catch fish in too high a number or fish they aren't supposed to catch at all, then launder their catch via shipping boats. For all these reasons, 1 out of every 5 fish that ends up on a plate was illegally caught. But more importantly, it's why what's always been seen as an inexhaustible resource is being increasingly pushed to the brink by a devastatingly, ruthlessly efficient machine. And the existential threats posed to our oceans aren't just confined to fish populations either. The ocean's potential most valuable treasures may, in fact, serve not to nourish, but to heal. Traditional medicine has relied on plants and animals from the ocean for millennia, but despite long-held aversion, modern medicine is now increasingly recognizing the value of some of these treatments. There's the drug called Halaven, over $300 million in sales per year, that extends the life of late-stage breast cancer patients by 5 or 6 months, and it's derived from a Japanese sea sponge. There's the drug called Prialt, which is remarkably effective at treating severe chronic pain, evades the downsides of opioids, and is based on the venom of sea-based cone snails. And beyond these and more already in use, there are a dozen or so more marine-based drugs currently making their way through clinical testing. This makes sense. After all, there are countless drugs that leverage the compounds found in land-based plants and animals for their healing properties, but the ocean is a far more biodiverse place than land. A majority of Earth's biodiversity is in the ocean. There are more distinct plants or animals that could be used for drugs, they just need to be found. The ocean is woefully underexplored. In fact, only about 10% of marine species are thought to have even been discovered, but the difficulty of marine exploration and sampling is lowering as...
Girdėjau, kad čia nesenai eksplorino labai vandens gilumas. Kaip ten ta kompanija vadinas? Ocean Gate atrodo, girdėjau kažką ten. Girdėjot, gal jūs irgi kažką jie ten eksplorino. Tai eksplorina tą vandenį. Pabiškai.
As more and more submersibles are being developed, and even more so as the costs of testing and studying samples has cratered. DNA sequencing, for example, is an important part of this, and whereas in 2001 it cost over $5,000 to sequence 1 million bases, today that cost is down to almost half a cent. Therefore, whereas today the use of these marine genetic resources is largely confined to useful yet niche drugs, there is an expectation that due to increased exploration and research, someday soon, someone might identify a groundbreaking compound to treat a common illness and set off a pharmaceutical gold rush in the world's oceans. But a far more literal gold rush also sits on the ocean's horizon. That's because down below, on its floor, are these polymetallic nodules. These are potato-sized clumps of metals. It varies, but notably they include some valuable ones like manganese, zinc, cobalt, copper, and nickel. And they're really just sitting there. This is rather tantalizing, especially these days. As the world looks to build more wind turbines, electric car batteries, and other bastions of a decarbonized grid, these metals are in greater and greater demand. There's going to have to be more production somewhere, and some argue that deep-sea mining has the potential to develop into a low-cost, low-impact source compared to land-based mining. Naturally, others disagree. Collecting these nodules at scale, at least with current technology, requires significant disturbance to the seafloor, which would inevitably destroy marine habitats and kick up huge plumes of sediment that would impact surrounding sea life. The ocean floor also stores large amounts of carbon, and so there's also a concern that the disturbance could release the carbon up into the atmosphere, thereby further negating any environmental benefit. Right now, nobody's mining the ocean floor at commercial scale.
Gerai, aš turiu vis tiek pasakyti, dabar mes žiūrim tą video legit. Dave the Diver, žaidimas Steam'e. Aš jį reklamavau Discord'e keletą kartų jau, tavasme, amazing game'as. Labai kokybiškas game'as. Tai jeigu jums patinka ten tokie biški indie žaidimai, kai galite įsijungti pažiūrėti, bet ten toks gan unikalus game'as, labai nenobodus toks, veiksmų ištisai, toks pacingas geras, labai tiesiog kokybiškas game'as. Išbaigtas, padarytas, tai jo, jeigu kam tik biškai patinka tokio tipo geimai, tai iš karto siūlau jau tą, tai tikrai siūlau, labai fainas geimas ir labai čia tiesiog rodo ten irgi apie povandeninę eksploraciją maždaug ir žuvis gaudo ir prekiauja ir žodžiu, taip, bet ten, jo, čia aš kaip apibūdinau, tai techniškai ir apie tai ir ne apie tai. Žiūrim toliau.
The International Seabed Authority, the UN body responsible for regulating such activity, has
lengvas, tai visi gali žaisti.
Exploratory licenses for small-scale tests. But this could change very, very soon thanks to the second section of the 15th paragraph of the first annex of the 1994 agreement relating to the implementation of Part 11 of the United Nations Convention of the Law of the Sea. What this essentially states is that if an ISA member nation wants to start deep-sea mining operations, the authority has 2 years to set rules on how that can take place. On July 9th, 2021, the nation of Nauru triggered that 2-year countdown. July 9th, 2023 has now come and gone, and the International Seabed Authority has failed to set rules on deep-sea mining, meaning Nauru and all nations are now theoretically allowed to start any sort of operations with absolutely zero environmental restrictions. Now, given that the International Seabed Authority regulates international waters, the high seas, Nauru would simply be the facilitator in a theoretical deep-sea mining operation. It wouldn't happen in their waters. As an ISA member nation, they're partnered with Canada-based The Metals Company, essentially serving as a friendly government willing to submit a license application to the International Seabed Authority on the company's behalf. Presumably because larger governments, like Canada's, are unwilling to be seen as the first to open the door to an environmentally destructive process. Once a license application is submitted by Nauru, it would then be reviewed by the ISA's Legal and Technical Commission on whether it meets the body's regulations, which don't currently exist, which would issue a recommendation to the organization's 36-member voting council. But this is where things get tricky. The council has told the Legal and Technical Commission not to issue recommendations until regulations are set to avoid having to vote on one, but a subset of members are arguing that this is a violation of the law of the sea. They say that the Legal and Technical Commission's role is to examine compliance with whatever the regulations are, and since there are no regulations, any application must be recommended for approval. No application has yet been submitted, but essentially, the authority is setting itself up for a legal showdown. There is no consensus on how their system is supposed to work, and therefore, it's at risk of breaking down. Meanwhile, the body also seems deadlocked on the overall issue. Some members, like Nauru and China, are fully in support of regulated but abundant deep-sea mining. Others, like Switzerland and Germany, are in support of a moratorium until further study can be done on the practice's effects, while others still, like France, are already in support of an outright ban on deep-sea mining, convinced that the gain is not worth the cost. But at the end of the day, it's tough to understand whether this matters at all because some 30 or so nations are not even members of the ISA and therefore aren't subject to its rules. This includes, most notably, the United States. Its Senate voted not to ratify the treaty that would have led to ISA membership, with many of those dissenting specifically citing the potential that the body would restrict deep-sea mining operations that the country might want to permit. Therefore, the US's National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration has already granted exploratory licenses to American companies, and while these aren't recognized by the ISA, companies might use them as the authority on which to begin their operations in international waters. If the US decides to allow full-scale commercial operations, while the ISA does not, this could kick off a showdown between the UN and US as companies use American backing as the legal authority on which to base their international operations. At this point, what happens with deep-sea mining is still very much up in the air.
Įdomu, nes
As for
net
the management
girdėjęs.
of the rest of the treasures abound in
Iš tikrųjų, nesu net girdėjęs apie tokį dalyką kaip deep sea mining ir kad tai yra iš vis an issue, bet pasirodo yra gan an issue. Gal dar netokio, aukšto lygio, bet tikiu, kad kai kurie sprendimai ir kai kurie įstatymai ir, kokios nors ten kaip čia dėrybos, kartais, ypač su tom šalim, kurios, kaip čia, susijusios su to, arba turi interesą į tą. Ir dėrėsi su Amerika, žinai. Kartais gali ir tą iškelt kaip tokia kaip kortą žaidiminę arba mėginti kažką palankaus savo susitarti ar panašiai. Dar vienas toks, kaip čia, dar viena atšaka, kur gal kada nors kaip dėrybų punktas naudojamas.
international waters, though, some sort of systematic management might start with this: the Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction Treaty, or the Treaty of the High Seas, as it's become known. While these 54 pages of term definitions, provisions, articles, and objectives didn't make a major newsplash, the agreement to the final draft at UN headquarters on March 4th, 2023 was a big deal. Nearly 20 years in the making, the Treaty of the High Seas addresses something that had slipped through the cracks in previous agreements involving international waters: nature and natural resources. This treaty sets a framework for sharing access to marine genetic resources between countries in the form of samples, data, and sequencing, a framework for requiring environmental impact assessment should one party consider another's activity potentially environmentally harmful, and a groundwork to begin management of marine protected areas where all harvesting of resources is strictly prohibited. In other words, should something be harvested on the high seas for scientific purposes, the findings will need to be shared. Should a country launch a project on the high seas, then others will have the right to first require an impact assessment. And should the UN reach its goal for protecting 30% of the ocean by 2030, it will use the tools provided in the document to make decisions on protected areas. But for those concerned with the prospect of deep-sea mining, the treaty has been seen as a bit of a letdown, as it doesn't encompass high seas activities that already have their own regulatory bodies like the ISA, a point that China has been unwilling to move off of throughout negotiations. But for the bigger picture, those concerned with the immediate future of ocean environments in the face of major threats, this has been viewed as an unprecedented win, something that hasn't been done before, and something that has the potential to fundamentally alter the ocean's future. But the treaty still has a long way to go. With the draft agreed to in March, the agreement wasn't actually adopted until as recently as June 20th, 2023 at the UN Intergovernmental Conference, and isn't expected to open for nation signatures until September, at which point it will become law 2 months after the 60th country has ratified it. With the EU, US, and China all playing roles in negotiating the treaty, it's expected that all the major players in international waters will ratify sooner or later. But even then, once ratified, should nothing go wrong, it's still an international treaty, a style of agreement that's hardly proved the end-all be-all in regards to environmental efforts. With sovereign states looking out for their own interests first and foremost, these agreements are usually backed as long as they're convenient. Look no further than the Paris Agreement being hamstrung by countries choosing their own emissions cuts and scaling back their own commitments after signing. And also look no further than the Paris Agreement as an example of a treaty becoming so overly politicized that the US withdrew from it entirely at one point. International treaties work when they don't get in the way of state interest, but they become much harder to uphold once it conflicts with the immediate interests of a nation, or worse still, happens to benefit one over the other. Perhaps most potentially damning, though, is the issue of enforcement. In the most simple terms, the UN doesn't have a navy, the oceans are impossibly vast, and nations have struggled to protect their own exclusive economic zones from poaching the world over, let alone the open seas. There may be buy-in now, but enforcing compliance and regulating the high seas will ultimately inform the success and impact of the treaty. The prospect of unregulated deep-sea mining feels existential. It feels like something that could permanently alter perhaps the most pristine areas on the planet, the final corners untouched by human hands. But this existential threat has already been realized. The transition from small-scale to industrial fishing has wreaked havoc on the oceans. A third of global fish stocks are being overfished, meaning fish are being removed faster than they reproduce. Another 60% is being fished at the reproduction rate. Nearly no fish stocks are growing globally, and all of these statistics are trending further and further towards oblivion. There is enormous economic incentive for individual actors to continue to fish as much as they can. This is the tragedy of the commons, and while this problem can be solved on a national level, the world has yet to find a true long-term solution to solving this internationally. When each nation has to opt into regulating itself, the tragedy of the commons stays alive. Individual actors will choose to follow the economic incentives and opt themselves out. To date, fishing is perhaps the most tangible manifestation of this problem. In modern times, there aren't many other resources that can be pulled from an environment so devoid of rules, regulations, or repercussions. But technological development threatens to open up new categories with these same problems, and not only in the oceans. There's also the entire rest of the universe. Outer space operates under the same system. Its laws are based on maritime law and therefore face the same shortcomings. Asteroid mining is a near direct analogy of deep-sea mining in terms of the legal and environmental conundrums it cracks open. There's little understanding of how the world will effectively regulate such a practice, and like with deep-sea mining, marine pharmacology, and more, there's reason to be pessimistic when looking at fishing as precedent. As the world globalizes and technology advances, problems and potential are growing increasingly beyond national scale, so one must find ways to use the age-old practice of diplomacy to build cooperation and consensus for the good of all over the good of one. And perhaps the best problem to solve first is not the hypothetical,
What the fuck?
but the one that exists now, right in front of us.
Biški
Solve the fish,
nardo
and
laivelis.
maybe we can solve the future.
Okay.
You might be surprised to hear just how much more of a problem this ship is than this one. I certainly was when researching.
Skaičiau reklamą. Ok. Jo, čia sužinau kažką naujo, pasirodo tas maninimas netgi yra didelis talking pointas dabar jau. Ok.
Koks vakaras ilgas, kaip širdį man kelia. Nuskink man jazminą,